Hello, and welcome to Chapter 7. The title of the chapter is A Quantum Model of Atoms. So we're moving away from thermochemistry and thinking about energy in terms of heat that's being let off in chemical reactions and in phase changes and things like that. And now, instead, in this chapter, we're diving into what's happening with the energy in a single atom, thinking about what's happening in individual atoms. At the beginning of the class, you may remember we talked about this model of the atom where we have a small positively charged nucleus, and we said the electrons are out here somewhere doing stuff. And the goal of this chapter is to answer the question maybe you've been wondering, like, what exactly are they doing? How do we know about what's happening with electrons in atoms? And so that's the goal of this chapter, is to talk give you a foundation in the quantum mechanics that underlie what happens with electrons in atoms. Because those electrons are really important as we continue talking about molecules and bonds as we get into chapters 8 and 9, where we're going to be looking at how atoms come together to form molecules and covalent bonds and how we represent those. And then in chapter 9, where we look at what shapes do they make as these molecules come together. So, but before we can do any of that, we've got to understand what's happening in an individual atom before we start putting them together into molecules. All this is related to what we talked about just now with thermochemistry, because all of this involves energy. The energy is involved with the electrons, the energy is in atoms. So we're going to start in a place that may seem counterintuitive. We're going to talk about atoms and electrons, but to start the chapter off, we're actually going to start talking about light. We'll get to that in the next video, but I just want to introduce sort of an outline of the chapter. We're going to start talking about light because a lot of what we know about atoms comes from light, because we can't actually measure the atoms directly very easily. We have in more recent years been able to develop microscopes that can actually see on the atomic level, which is really neat. But this wasn't true when they were figuring these things out. We had to understand how atoms work to make those microscopes. So you can't really use those microscopes to get the information in the first place. But a lot of the information that we understand about atoms comes through measurements of light and how it interacts with matter. So we're going to start with light, and then we're going to talk about, how do we know, or why do we have quantum mechanics? So again, a lot of this comes from measurements involving light. And so what's the foundation where this started? And then we'll move into, once we sort of understand why we develop quantum mechanics, move into what it tells us about atoms. And we'll get into, hopefully, things, if you've taken chemistry before, hopefully you're familiar with this idea of orbitals or have heard of it before, and how electrons fit into orbitals and how we can describe those orbitals and things like quantum numbers and such. But this is just an outline looking at where we're going with this chapter. So in the next video, we'll start talking about properties of light, not in extensive detail, but enough to understand what we're going to be talking about in this chapter.